All right, welcome everybody to the Live Talk Politics podcast. Hey, thank you so much for your patience today as we work through some very serious technical issues. The computer apparently decided to just shut down. But in the meantime, I wanted to welcome you to the only show where you don't just watch news, but to help make it. Think of it like this: every Tuesday at 8:30 p.m., you can join us for conversation amongst friends about politics. And what we'll start off like this. First, we'll cover what you guys want to talk about in our Pulse of the People section. Pretty much each day, if you go to our Talk Politics discussion group, join us live for all the interactive conversation right in that group. And in the meantime, following that, we will cover our national news before adding some commentary. So again, thank you all very much. And if you do want to support the stream, perhaps to even help us stop outages, go to ko-fi.com/Reichenbach Media, and that way you can donate to our stream. But in the meantime, hey, I wanted to cover what it was that you guys were talking about in Pulse of the People. So, hey, we are covering Pulse of the People, bringing up what it is that you guys are talking about. So, earmarks, do you guys support earmarks? Yay or nay? That was the big question that I asked this week, in part because I know that some politicians support earmarks, some don't. And so we had a pretty lively conversation about earmarks in our Talk Politics group. Tim Glass mentioned that the congressional spending needs moderate. Of course, it always does. And earmarks is perhaps one contributor to our federal spending. In fact, it may be one of the most corrupt, well, depending on how you view it, it could be viewed as a corrupt way of doing politics, where politicians lobby for earmarks and say, hey, if you give me this, I'll give you that. And it creates a little bit of horse trading that ultimately cost the taxpayers without giving us much of a return. Now, where we really got into it was with Thomas. Thomas said it's the duty of Congress to specify how funds are expended, not just write blank checks. So Thomas voted in support of earmarks, and what he seemed to imply is that the Constitution doesn't prohibit earmarks. And the point that I was trying to make to Thomas was that, yes, the Constitution in and of itself may not prohibit earmarks, but that doesn't mean that they don't undermine federalism. And as he mentioned, that they may overstep the bounds of the Constitution, saying that the federal government isn't supposed to fund local projects. And I said, well, but they do. And so the problem with earmarks is that they undermine federalism and local communities taking care of themselves because you have a over reliance on federal funds. Outside of that, I think the idea is sensible and good enough, but I'm interested in hearing what it is that you guys think. Do you guys support earmarks? Should we be setting up special funds that members of Congress can use to disperse for earmarks? Earmarks, yay or nay? And so as I mentioned, Thomas said, well, I don't totally agree with that, but they can have that power. Ryan mentioned that they work with single subject bills, but they were death by a trillion cuts during the Pelosi Paul Rodha omnibus days. Let's hope the current House rule stands. So in Congress currently, you have a general, I don't think there's a general prohibition on earmarks, but they did set up single subject bills. But the other reason why I wanted to ask about to discuss earmarks, well, I'll just leave it at that. So yeah, single subject bills, most people were actually against it, although not many people mentioned why. Again, I'm not totally sure one way or another. I don't know if they make impact, but my overall concern is with federalism and too many local governments relying on federal earmarks, which basically just means that taxpayers of that locality pay for their money to only be sent back to them, which is a sure sign of more government and efficiency. So, hey, earmarks. Most y'all said nay. And then, hey, this gentleman named Phil Day said, for the sake of our constitutional republic, seize the funds that pay people to stay home and get back to basics. And they said, well, interesting point, Phil. Some people may view earmarks as part of the basics. I don't think I do, but it's out there. And then you guys, we were talking about, well, we first talked about the IRS. The IRS added over 80,000 agents to their ranks. So what I wanted to ask is, would you support replacing the complex income tax with something similar to axe the IRS? Because if we don't have a simpler form of taxation, right, then we're never going to be able to get rid of the IRS, which exists because our tax system is so fundamentally complicated. And so, you can have provisions that say, oh, hey, we're going to repeal all these IRS agents. Well, ultimately, that doesn't make so much sense, because if you get rid of those IRS agents, you're still going to have trouble in getting people to comply with this complicated tax code. Now, by making it simpler, you could also bring in more revenue in general. So that's what I wanted to ask. Hey, do you guys support replacing the complex income tax with something similar to axe the IRS? Most people said yes. Hey, that's a good idea. We can get rid of the IRS. Some said no. A few others commented, and then we had some interesting responses here. Tom mentioned that the current system is fair and simple. Once you understand you don't meet the definition of a taxpayer. Well, Tom, I agree with you, but I don't think putting it on an RS form that, hey, I'm not a taxpayer, I don't comply with that definition, I don't think that would fly. And then Christine mentioned taxation is theft. Well, I think in some ways taxation is indeed theft. But if we're going to have it, insofar as we're humans and not angels living in this utopia, we got to do more to make the system simpler and fair in order to guarantee that more people pay, and we don't have to have this vast bureaucracy that does perhaps illegal things. I mean, another problem with the complexity of the IRS is that you have all these agencies. Or forgive me, all these agents in the IRS, and then they can leak the tax return of one of their enemies, and then there's no consequence for that leak. From I think there's a gentleman named Ken Griffin. His information they leaked Trump's, and then they were denying conservative nonprofit groups that nonprofit status. So the only way to create a fairer system that doesn't involve this bureaucracy is to fundamentally simplify the tax code. Now, somebody mentions, hey, let's do an income tax that can be done by sending a postcard for most people to the IRS, and that's it. Well, yeah, for sure. And so that's what it is that I was thinking here is, okay, people are complaining about getting rid of or people want to get rid of the IRS. Well, we need a fairer system, which is what House Republicans proposed. And I think it makes sense when you view it from that frame. Hey, let's have a national sales tax that'll have a start all over, and we'll be able to get rid of the IRS that way. Now, things could certainly be more complicated under that plan, which are calling the fair tax. But hey, it's better than nothing at this point in time. So Matt said, hey, will H&R voting block accept it? Heirs appointed to our fair tax. And then Mike, with perhaps the most insightful comment here, says, sales tax gives control to the buyer and keeps money flowing more efficiently in the economy. More money in pockets of consumers means more spending means more tax revenue, and it doesn't burn business. And that's, I think, exactly right. So fair tax. Hey, do you guys support fair tax? I think it makes sense. And one objection that people have to this fair tax is the idea that, well, if you have a national sales tax, that will unfairly harm the poor. And that's where I was going with this next question. I said, the PA lottery system is effectively a tax on low-income earners. Do you support that? And if your answer is yes, then how do you defend the lottery system? So my point here is that, hey, I think it does to some degree make sense that all people pay tax. It shouldn't be just the middle class. It shouldn't be just the wealthy. It shouldn't be all these other people just paying tax. No, I don't know if I'm saying abolish the PA lottery. I think that you could replace lottery. I don't have a problem with lottery. I'm just saying that the lottery is a tax on low income earners because the money that comes in from that, yeah, I know. I'm just trying to clarify that the money that comes into the PA lottery is something that is used to fund many offices of the aging. So that is basically a tax. And moreover, you have people collecting government pension on it. And so the government makes money. It's a government program. It is therefore a tax. Right. The majority of lottery tickets are bought in low income zip codes. Right. And that's exactly my point. So therefore, it can't be the case that we oppose taxing low income earners when people aren't protesting the PA lottery. Like, people must be okay with some level of taxation if they are being honest. And that's what I'm trying to point out. And I'm pointing that out because some people would object to getting rid of the complicated tax system we have now because it would hurt low income earners. Well, you guys don't seem to care about it hurting low income earners when it comes to the lottery, right? And so Bill questions, well, I wonder what the pensions and government benefits that are taken out of the lottery, right? Yeah, that's one thing that I'm trying to get at, Bill, is that regardless of whether the lottery is a sales tax or not, it funds government. That money gets spent, and it funds government pension. The PA lottery system is an expansion of big government. Now, Mike and I went back and forth. How is it a tax if you don't play? Well, Mike, what I was trying to say is, yes, you can have taxes that exist without you having to pay them if they are a sales tax. And that's my entire point right here. And so Mike is saying, so you just assume that low income people are unaware and that most who play are low income earners. That's a heck of an assumption and painting with a broad brush. Well, is it painting with a broad brush, or is it true? Is it true that low income earners play the lottery more? I think so. And if we're going to get rhetorical about just using honest terms, then we're always going to run into any kind of significant barrier to making real reform. We can't change anything if you're going to accuse me of painting with a broad brush, this, that, whatever. I'm not. I'm just saying what it is. And so you have a whole faulty system of low income earners playing the lottery, and they continue to play as they age and they get older and older and older, and then that money just goes back to them through the government anyhow. So how does that make any sense? It's like a cycle of bureaucracy that doesn't have to exist if we have a simpler tax code, right? Including a national sales tax. And somebody says, well, you act like people don't have a choice. You act as though they aren't responsible for their decisions. Get off of it. If the lottery system is a scheme or not, they're not forcing anybody to purchase. Why not go after casinos? Why not include them too? And then, well, my fantasy world is apparently not factual or truthful. But I didn't say any of those things. I just said it was a tax. And so at some point here, I get called a left winger. Such is life. You'll either be a left winger and not liked by anybody, or a right winger and not liked by anybody. And heck, if you take a stand in the middle, you probably still won't be liked anyhow. So hey, who knows, right? Who knows? And so yes, most people say it's voluntary, and a lot of people don't like it. Now I'm also Phil said well, if being thoughtful is radical, then yes, I guess that's radical. I mean, heck, perhaps that is radical today, is being thoughtful instead of being purely rhetorical and in the bag for one party 100% of the time. Yeah, but hey, so be it. Must be how it is. And Phil said, "Hey, cut spending and replace all completely necessary taxes with lotteries." Well, that's not what I'm trying to say at all. I'm just again saying, if a tax must exist, then it should either be a flat tax, we tax all people at 3%, or a national sales tax, and that would be the fairest and most equitable way to do it. And those taxes are objected to by people who say we can't have those because it would hurt low income people. Okay, we're already taxing low income people through the lottery system to start with. So is it really that radical or bad? No. Yeah, I just got an ad for the Pennsylvania lottery. Yeah, well, of course they're listening. They probably have somebody auditing whether or not this is a legal stream, or they probably have the FBI investigating whether or not somebody with the name of Zygmunt should even be allowed to have a stream. It sounds too foreign. So hey, well, we didn't reach a consensus on that. We had a lot of disagreement. People don't think it's a tax, but hey, well, I think it is. It only makes sense that it is. No, but I guess in other words, I mean, to conclude, if you want to change the system of taxation, I guess you just can't honestly mention to people that would also include low income earners, because people get too upset about it to make any sense. So then I asked, I said, okay, guys, well, what's one political topic you wish people more frequently addressed? And this is a good question. We have a lot of silence in our culture, and we have many people who don't want to be honest about what's going on. And just as that's happening, we have many people who don't want to say anything important because they're afraid that they're going to be disavowed by their peers. They're not going to be able to be on team Republican or whatever. And so I'm just trying to create a setting where people can talk honestly. And one thing that I most definitely know people need to talk honestly about is Social Security. We have people saying Republicans want to cut Social Security, and that has never happened. Really, all Republicans have said is we need to change the program so that it's softened. And if we don't change, it's going to cut automatically at 2035 by some estimates, and others 2033. So it's going to cut itself if people don't take action now. But we can't even have that conversation because people aren't being honest, just in general, or they don't understand. And politicians know that. And so then instead of spending time to help people think about what this program is, they would rather grandstand and say this and that and not do the right thing by modifying. And as Rob knows, hey, yeah, it's unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional. And that's right. I don't see anywhere in the Constitution where it says we have to have a mandatory pension program for anybody having old age. It's not. I know that there are Supreme Court decisions regarding the legality of Social Security, and I think that those are wrong. And if I'm not mistaken, those rulings were done by judges that were being threatened by court packing. So that's not even legitimate to start with. Any judge then that ruled, that made a decision because they were afraid of court packing, none of those decisions, I think, are legitimate after they've been through. It's just not. Kenny mentions foreign policy. And so, yeah, we don't talk enough about that either. That's why I wanted to have that be a subject of discussion in this stream. And there's a ton of articles that I have on this because it is so underthought. People have no clue what's going on in the globe, and as a result, we end up in all these foreign wars. We end up in foreign entanglements. We have military here, bases here, and then the costs just keep accruing, and the politicians keep talking up and trying to justify war. And I think if people really understood what it was that was going on, that would never happen. It wouldn't. And I'm here to prove that today with the articles that we will be discussing later. Pete wants to focus on removing waste at PennDOT and creating more accountability for sure. There's not enough oversight of PennDOT. And not only is there no oversight, if I'm not mistaken, there's not a great way of tracking how these federal funds are being spent and measuring whether or not they're effective to start with. As I talked with somebody before, I was talking with a policy expert on just federal infrastructure spending, and he said, yeah, part of the problem is there's no way to track whether or not any of this spending is effective. So we passed all these infrastructure programs, and we had no way of knowing whether or not that's going to create any jobs, create anything, or anything long-lasting or substantial. And that's because we never had any accountability. We just had people say, hey, you have to spend, spend, spend. Okay, great. We're willing to spend. Do we know if this is effective? People don't ask enough questions, and that's why we end up with all this big infrastructure program. Matt mentioned how he wanted to hear more about or have it covered how we exceed NATO contributions, whereas a number of members don't meet their 2% GDP spending. And that's also true. That's true. And we should talk about that as part of a bigger piece in how we think about foreign policy in general, which most of the time we're really not doing at all. Then he said the importance of building your local committees. Yeah, that's true. And I would be happy to discuss that subject. And then Troy mentioned the need to remove prevailing wage from all public sector jobs. And so for those who don't know, basically prevailing wage means union set wage. And that's been negotiated in Pennsylvania, for example, such that any new Pennsylvania construction that's public has to match prevailing wage, which is set by unions. So yeah, maybe in the future I will create just whole episodes on these individual topics. I think they're all worth covering in greater detail. So what do you guys think? What's one issue that hasn't been covered? Make sure to leave your answers in the chat, and if you can, go to ko-fi.com/Reichenbach Media, and that way you can help us reach more people. I'm going to be launching ads. I hadn't done it yet, but I will. I will be launching ads so we can reach more people and have better, more informative conversations about politics that aren't happening, because people would rather be demagogues than either honest journalists or honest analysts or honest thinkers. And that's why this program is so important. But hey, well, it's time to get to it. The big national nonsense. So hey, yeah, no, you're No, I'm not trying to curb your passion, Pete, for the work that we are getting into the curbing PennDOT's unbridled power and spending. I think we can do those things, Pete. But we just have to have some measure of how to better do so. And so nationally, there is, well, when it comes to national politics, there is much less going on in terms of actual bills being passed. So that's why I figured it would be a great opportunity to talk about foreign policy, particularly what's going on overseas. And with Russia and Ukraine, there's a lot more moving parts to that than what people might initially imagine in general. And so, in our national nonsense, hey, mission creep, how the U.S. role in Ukraine has slowly escalated. So, first, it started off as, well, we just have to help Ukraine and we have to stop Russia. And now Biden has said, well, we must strive to prevent direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia. Okay. And that's when he said, and at the beginning, well, our forces are not and will not be engaged in conflict. Now, that apparently isn't true. And in some ways, our forces, if you count the FBI as some sort of force, is proactively involved in helping Ukraine in general. Right? Our government is deploying FBI agents to clean up corruption in Ukraine. So if that's not some kind, I mean, those aren't boots on the ground, but there is, U.S. personnel there. Moreover, okay, the initially agreed upon terms of arms transfer that's since been canceled or overextended, and so then we keep sending more and more weapons over there, and while Russian forces make advances, we just keep sending more and more things. In fact, we'd actually recently sent over more tanks, and so then we have to wonder, just how long is it before we actually are just in a outright war with these people, right? And in fact, just last week, the Biden administration is poised to cross another major line, saying that they are considering giving Ukraine the green light to attack Crimea, even while acknowledging the risk of nuclear retaliation. So hey, all in all, things are out the window at this point. People don't care. People don't care, and heck, I mean, that is where we are at. Our government's moving us towards war, and people at this point aren't paying attention, or they're checked out. But that's what's going on, and so hey, that's something that's fundamentally important to think about. Likewise, so as we're preparing for a war in Russia, China is trying to change, and as this article seems to point out, China has made specific accommodations to help de-escalate war, and instead our politicians are insisting the very opposite. And as Mr. Jorgen Mueller mentions, China is sending interesting signals to the U.S. as anyone listening. And basically what he's saying is, okay, China has taken a number of actions indicating that they are trying to de-escalate this conflict. For one, after these last shutdowns, when they had a COVID zero policy still in place, they reopened to invite more business in. That should be sign one that China isn't the aggressive power that they're being made out to be. They did a 180 on a bad policy, and now they're trying to change. Likewise, okay, likewise, as the author seems to imply here, although it seems as if more power has been concentrated in the hands of President Xi, that may not totally be the case. That power may not be real, and that may be a greater sign of desperation than strength. It may not be the case that Xi loyalists are 100% on his side, but rather maybe perhaps they are trying to actually protect the fragile nature of their government in China. That's important. Likewise, the CCP understands that it's legitimized on the basis of its strong economy, and when that economy weakens, as it has, okay, then the regime is not it's not favorable in the public's eye. So they've already done 180s. They've done things out of desperation, and therefore, as the author concludes here, there's no reason to just assume that China is this rogue power trying to conquer the world. And that's important to note because our politicians aren't wanting to send us to war with China. We have reports now. So yeah, right. I wouldn't trust the government. There are far too many government contractors than there are people that have the best interests of the U.S. And that's right, though. That's exactly right. And so we're being sold a war when in reality, China is doing what it can to avoid war. For example, a big feature on Breitbart was Mike Pompeo on generals warning of war with China in 2025. Our military should get ready. For what? China isn't China isn't an invasive military power. And yet we have propagandists like Mike Pompeo saying that the U.S. would be at war with China over Taiwan in 2025. Okay. War over Taiwan in 2025. And what's the basis for that? China approves of us selling their goods. Yeah, sure, Riz. I'm sure China does approve of us selling their goods, and we should try to establish some kind of trade agreement between us and China, so that way there's less of a chance for war. Because if two nations are trading powers, it's going to be less likely, right, that they're going to want to go to war. Now, that doesn't mean that would totally prevent a war, but it would seem to be less likely. And instead, we have our politicians escalating the issue, not only with Russia and Ukraine, but then they're trying to escalate the issue with China when the facts really tell us that China isn't trying to go to war with anybody, really. They're trying to do the opposite. They're trying to restore faith, so that because if they don't restore faith in the eyes of their own people, they're not going to be considered legitimate fundamentally. And so it's particularly important to know as our government tries to sell us on getting a war in 2025. And what will happen is when Pompeo isn't elected president and he doesn't win, will he be held accountable for these irresponsible statements? No. No. In fact, here's what I'll say. Not only is this irresponsible, but it's also a distraction from what's really going on here in the U.S. Okay, we have an economic problem that we would be able to better deter other nations if we had a powerful economy, but we don't, because we have all this debt. We have endless mountains of debt. And instead of focusing on that problem, which politicians don't want to tackle because it's too thorny, they want to fearmonger for a war that's not going to happen. And then also escalate a war that could happen with Russia. With Russia. Why? And that's something that really ought to be considered. Now, in addition to all the problems with Russia and China, the U.S. is trying to come out and say that Russia has violated a warhead treaty that had been signed in 2011, and now the U.S. is trying to get Russia to accept these terms. Well, why didn't that happen before this whole thing started? Why are we negotiating a treaty after we've already escalated that conflict? Who knows? And he says, well, it's difficult to address Washington's concerns as long as the U.S. doesn't reconsider its extremely hostile line towards Russia. So we've aggravated hostilities fundamentally with Russia. And now they're saying, well, it's hard to continue that because we're extremely hostile towards them. And so this is just another line of nonsense that's been continued in our foreign policy, because making Russia look like the bad guy is something that will boost presidential approval ratings. It'll let members of Congress. It's basically, at this point in time, between China and Russia, it's a get out of jail free card for politicians who really don't want to think about what it is that's going on. Hey, well, all our problems, Russia, China, and we don't care if you guys are going into debt. We don't care about a recession. We don't care about the administrative state that's undermining our powers. We don't care. We're just going to try to make you guys paranoid about a war that either won't happen or fundamentally shouldn't happen. And is anybody taking responsibility? Of course not. Bill mentions some people's livelihoods to depend on war. Sure, Bill, that's true. The main people's livelihoods that depend on war is Halliburton, Raytheon, and other wealthy DC elites who send out cocktail invitations as they discuss the logistics of war. I mean, that's what it is. That's going on, Bill. And if I see, to me, that's not a livelihood. That's a sham. That's a sham perpetrated on the American people by our government that's not typically being transparent or honest about what's going on, not only what's going on overseas, but what transgressions against other nations that we ourselves have perpetrated. And a perfect example of that, Bill, is the Uyghurs. So in the United States, our politicians are relying on condemning China for holding Uyghurs, but we did the same thing. We did the same thing in Guantanamo Bay. Now, sure, it's not to the same extent, but as this article points out, and if you research Uyghurs in China, what it is that you'll find out is one reason why they're being detained is, in fact, the many Uyghurs in China used to be, from what I understand, and guys, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, they used to be considered a terrorist group in 2006. And so China doesn't want these Uyghurs undermining their government. But for us, back in 2011, we had Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking, predominantly Muslim ethnic group from Xinjiang region in far western China, also known by some as East Turkestan. In the early 2000s, few Americans had ever heard or even known how to pronounce the word Uyghur. And so that changed to some degree when we held 24 of them. And Guantanamo Bay, and we actually accused them of being terrorists, enemy combatants. Whoops. But then after years of court battles and campaigns by their family and human rights groups, they were able they were able to leave that detention camp in 2013. 22 Uyghurs held at Guantanamo were all eventually declared non-combatants. But here's the thing. Here's what we did to the Uyghurs in the U.S. They couldn't go back to the place in China that they were from, and the we didn't accept them. Instead, we said, well, we're going to let them go to small European and Central American nations. So we made an accusation. We didn't own up to it, and then we took them. We shipped them to somewhere else where they don't know the language or the culture or anything at all. And so that only points to the dishonesty that's perpetrated by the United States government and saying, well, we're against Uyghurs in China. No. That's not true. The United States did the exact same thing. And moreover, if United States citizens, if our government was concerned about Uyghurs in China, okay, why not set up a resettlement program here in the U.S.? And if not the U.S., then where? Probably nowhere, because no place wants to take in the Uyghurs. So we just have people complaining about a problem that they're also involved in, and then not coming up with any productive solution. And that's what always goes on more. We have people scapegoating left and right, and they don't take any responsibility. And what I'm about to say, yeah, right, Bill. Blame it on Russia, and people will believe the narrative. Yeah, you blame anything on Russia. You can blame Trump. You can blame the economy. Anything's on Russia. Anything's on China. We'll detain Uyghurs. We don't care. But here's the even more startling hypocrisy. Okay, is that people who point out facts like this, then that I just mentioned, people like Elon Omar, they're threatened with being kicked off of the Foreign Intelligence Committee. So you have people like Elon Omar who wants to say, hey, the United States has engaged in the same things that we're saying is bad that we do with the United States, and she's bringing that up. And people are just saying, oh, well, she has to get off this committee. And what anybody should really fear is that when there's a naysayer in Congress that either stands up against war or spending, and those people are politically retaliated against, that should raise a red flag for anyone. And in general, I probably don't agree with her policies, but I do think it's important. I do think it's important that we ask serious questions about foreign policy. And Elon Omar is actually, if you're keeping up with this, she is supported by Matt Gaetz. She saying that, she asks important questions. Right. And so last April, in the hearing about strategy in Asia, there was a committee hearing on that. And it involved Michael McCall, Ted Deutsch, so on and so forth. And it was her turn to talk about China's repression in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and arms sales in the Middle East. And what Ms. Omar wanted to point out is that the United States has supported brutal dictators like Chile's Augusto Pinochet and Indonesia's Suharto because they shared a common enemy. So she just wanted to know, why are we trying to set up in India a new Pinochet, right? And then it was only her who spoke out against the U.S. helping minority repression in India? Because in India, it's my understanding they don't have any fondness for Muslims there either, right? And so those are the sort of questions that she has, particularly when as I just mentioned, the U.S. imprisoned 22 Uyghurs in Guantanamo Bay. She's the only one raising these questions, and regardless of whether or not you like Ilhan Omar, you have to, if you're a person of integrity and courage, support somebody asking important questions instead of getting 24/7 propaganda for war. Is Ilhan Omar a saint? Probably not. And I'm not going to go into her personal life or background or anything like that. But she is asking important questions about foreign policy. For example, questions like, why is the U.S. government funding gross violations of human rights? Then that happens, right? And yet that's not stuff that's ever admitted publicly. And when she asks these questions about our foreign policy failures, people say, "Oh, well, she's against America, and that she's corrupt." No, she's asking important questions. Hey, if we're involved in all these things, what about the illegal things that we do, the immoral things we do? And to me, that is laudable. Hey, I guess I'm interested in hearing what you guys think. Should Ilhan Omar be kicked off the Foreign Intelligence Committee? I don't think so at this point, because I support people who ask questions. I'd be interested in hearing from you. And I guess we mostly covered foreign policy. I'll just tackle this story here for fun. So Kristi Noem was basically using in South Dakota. I know that I wanted to cover this because she's a presidential candidate, and some people absolutely adore and love this lady. But she was using the executive branch to pass or to offer bills without congressional authority. And the reason why that's important is because it's because if somebody's willing to do that as governor in a state now, then they would most definitely be willing to do that as president, right? And in my mind, we need fewer people using the executive branch as some kind of pulpit to make policy without getting people involved. It's not a legitimate function of the executive branch. So that is that. And that's what we get for national nonsense in news. Now we'll move into our commentary. I think one thing that we should learn throughout our discussion of politics is that partisanship is often blinding us to the truth. Our unfettered allegiance to a single party, group of people, particular policies, a brand, or a tribe, as some might say, all that is helping us to obscure what it is that's really going on behind the whole thing, behind the two-party system, behind the bickering back and forth, is a two-party establishment that has both agreed to oversee national debt and the decline of the US dollar. But see, partisanship is blinding us to this truth. It's blinding us to the truth that as we continue to engage in quibbling nonsense here at home, other nations around us are joining forces. They're joining forces through banking and getting rid of our financial systems and institutions. And at that point, having failed in the international system, Ian, domestically with economic policy. What will be left? Probably not much. But we'll never know because partisanship is blinding us to the truth. And it's blinding us to the truth by encouraging top-down policies even in Congress. You see, it's not just the president that has become a top-down dictatorial leader. That also happens within the halls of Congress. That's why you'll see folks on both sides that'll say, hey, you can't say this against the party. You can't say that. That's why you see so many political purity tests, because there's a top-down system in Congress that wants to stifle debate. It wants to stifle honesty, and it wants to stifle the truth. And many of you, myself included, have let it go on for far too long. You see, we have a top-down executive, a top-down Congress, and people who are becoming used to other people telling us what it is that we can and cannot do. For what? I don't see any reason why. In fact, I think, the very least, as good American citizens, we should continue to rally against not only a top-down, out-of-control executive branch, but a top-down, out-of-control Congress. And moreover, top-downism in our own home. Only we can rally against the top-down approach to politics that we've all come to sort of accept. But we can only do it by getting our voices out there, becoming involved. And well, that's what it is that I encourage all of you to do. So that's our show for tonight. Hey, sorry about the late start. We do appreciate the diligent viewers out there and ones who persevere. Anyhow, thank you so much for supporting us through the technical problems. Till next Tuesday, we will see you all later. And make sure to go to ko-fi.com/Reichenbach Media if you want to support this program. And make sure to continue to support our independent content creators out there. Without them, we will continue to not only have top-down Congress and a top-down president, but a top-down media. You can stop it. But until you do, we'll still be out here talking every Tuesday at 8:30. Until next time.